Something was wrong before anyone realized it. Not with the locks, not with the doors, not with the alarm system sitting untouched on the wall. What was wrong happened in the digital layer between Nancy Guthrie's house and the rest of the world. A layer most people never think about. A layer that is supposed to be invisible. On the night of February 1st, that layer was surgically removed, and the person who removed it understood exactly what they were doing. That detail has not received the attention it deserves, because buried inside the FBI's door-to-door canvas from March 6th is a technical finding that does not just add a piece to the puzzle, it changes the shape of the puzzle itself. It tells us that whoever took Nancy Guthrie did not arrive unprepared. They arrived after the work was already done. We are going to follow that work today, step by step, with the technical record, with the evidence on file, and with the understanding that whoever planned this left a trail they did not intend to leave. Because every layer of preparation is a layer of evidence. This is the Crime Files. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just evidence, just analysis, just the pursuit of truth. Nancy Guthrie was 64 years old. She lived alone in the Catalina foothills, a residential community on the northern edge of Tucson, Arizona. The neighborhood sits where the desert meets the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains. The homes there are spread apart. Long driveways, open land between properties, dark sky ordinances that restrict ambient lighting. It is the kind of place where the quiet feels intentional, where you can go weeks without seeing a neighbor on foot, where the distance between houses is not just physical but psychological. Nancy was a retired physician. She was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. People who knew her described her consistently as careful, methodical, and deeply private. She had installed security cameras. She wore a medical-grade pacemaker that monitored her cardiac data continuously and transmitted it wirelessly to her Apple devices. By every reasonable standard, she had taken the precautions a person in her situation would take. None of them were enough. She was taken sometime after midnight on February 1st. The last confirmed motion inside her home was recorded at approximately 1:47 in the morning. Her pacemaker, transmitting continuously, registered its final active data at 2:28. That is the last biological record of Nancy Guthrie as a free person inside her own home. At 2:36, a Ring camera located 2.5 miles from her house captured a vehicle moving away from the area. The Pima County Sheriff confirmed that the timing is consistent with the drive from Nancy's address at normal residential speed. 41 minutes. That is how long the gap is between her last recorded movement and the end of her pacemaker signal. 41 minutes, during which a person was inside her home, and no camera in the immediate vicinity recorded a single frame of how they got there or what vehicle they used to leave. Because the cameras that should have captured that had already been taken offline before the suspect ever arrived at her door. That is the finding. That is what the FBI was asking about on March 6th when they went door to door through the Catalina foothills. Not suspicious vehicles, not unfamiliar faces. Wireless internet disruptions. Whether anyone's cameras had gone dark on the night of February 1st, whether anyone's network had behaved in a way it had never behaved before, and what they found changed the geometry of this entire case. Let us go to the timeline. January 23rd, 9 days before the abduction, a figure appears on a Ring camera 6.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, in a different part of the Catalina foothills. The neighborhood shares the same structural characteristics as Nancy's street. Isolated desert properties, long setback driveways, dark sky ordinances, low ambient light. The figure is walking backward, not stumbling, not confused, walking backward with deliberate, sustained coordination, while keeping themselves oriented toward the camera at all times. When a dog barked from inside a nearby house, the figure ran, but they did not turn around. They maintained their backward orientation through the sprint. They would rather fall in the dark desert than give the camera a single clear frame of their face. That discipline does not come from fear. It comes from study. From someone who has researched how Ring cameras resolve facial features at varying distances and approached from the direction that minimizes image quality while keeping the lens in view. They understood the technology well enough to defeat it by becoming its ideal subject in reverse. Court documents and law enforcement briefings connected this figure to the February 1st incident through a single physical object. The Ozark Trail backpack. The same distinctive bag appears in both incidents, captured by separate cameras 9 days apart. That backpack is not a coincidence. It is a direct evidentiary thread between a reconnaissance operation and the abduction itself. That word matters. Reconnaissance. On January 23rd, the backward walker was not committing a crime at that address. They were running a test. They selected a property with the same surveillance architecture as their actual target, same camera placement logic, same residential setback distances, same ambient lighting. They walked through the coverage zone, learned the focal range, absorbed the layout, and then disappeared into the desert without consequence. 9 days of planning followed, and then on February 1st, the same person arrived at Nancy Guthrie's door. This time, they walked forward. They tapped the camera twice with a covered hand. Their body language was unhurried, controlled. The posture on the porch footage is not the posture of someone encountering an unexpected situation. It is the posture of someone who has already solved the problem they came to solve, and the cameras next door were already dark. Stop here, because this is where the case shifts. The cameras that went offline were not Nancy's cameras. Her Nest camera on the front porch was still running. The FBI recovered footage from it. The cameras that went dark belonged to a neighbor. Specifically, the cameras on the side of that neighbor's house that faced Nancy Guthrie's property. The cameras on the opposite side of the same house, connected to the same router, drawing electricity from the same circuit, stayed fully operational throughout the night. Same network, same hardware, same power source. The only variable was which direction the cameras pointed. That is not a power failure. That is not an internet outage. That is not a Ring system update that wiped a night of footage. That is a targeted disruption aimed at specific devices in a specific direction, and it means that before the suspect ever stepped onto Nancy's porch, someone had already mapped the surrounding surveillance infrastructure and neutralized the cameras that had a line of sight to her property. The planning did not begin on the night of February 1st. It was completed by the time the suspect arrived. Now let us be precise about what caused this, because the term wireless jammer appears in coverage of this case and most of the time it is being used incorrectly in ways that matter for understanding what actually happened. A conventional signal jammer works by flooding the radio frequency spectrum with interference. It transmits noise across the 2.4 GHz and 5 GHz bands that wireless routers use to communicate with connected devices. Everything within range loses its connection simultaneously. Cameras, phones, smart speakers, medical Bluetooth devices. The effect is total and indiscriminate. It does not distinguish between a Ring camera and a pacemaker. It kills everything. That is not what happened. Two pieces of evidence make this definitive. First, Nancy's Nest camera on the front porch continued recording long enough to capture the suspect approaching the door. FBI agents recovered that footage. If a standard jammer had been running before the suspect arrived, that camera would have been offline before the suspect reached the property. The footage would not exist. Second, Nancy's pacemaker maintained its Bluetooth connection to her Apple devices until 2:28 in the morning. A jammer capable of knocking out Ring cameras across multiple properties would have severed that low-energy Bluetooth signal immediately. It did not. Retired FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffender addressed this publicly. She stated that whatever caused the disruption was not a full-spectrum wireless jammer. The evidence from the porch camera and the pacemaker data makes that conclusion unavoidable. So what was it? There is a third type of device. It does not jam signals by overpowering the radio spectrum. It attacks at the protocol level, exploiting a structural vulnerability built into the wireless networking standard itself. It sends what are called duthentication packets. These are legitimate-looking commands that both the router and the connected device recognize as authentic network traffic. When the router receives the command, it tells the device to disconnect. When the device receives the command, it stops transmitting and attempts to reconnect. The attack sends these commands continuously, faster than the device can re-establish its connection, trapping it in a loop. The camera shows offline. The recording stops. From the outside, it looks identical to an internet outage. But it is not an outage. It is surgery. A duthentication tool can be aimed directionally, like a flashlight rather than a floodlight. It targets specific devices on a specific network from a specific physical angle. Devices shielded by a wall or positioned on the far side of a building receive no signal. They stay connected. They keep recording. Only the devices within the directional beam and within line of sight go dark. This is exactly what the evidence shows. The cameras facing Nancy's property went offline. The cameras on the other side of the same house did not. The Nest camera on Nancy's porch, angled to capture her front door rather than survey the neighboring properties, continued operating until the suspect physically covered it. The pacemaker signal persisted because Bluetooth operates on a different protocol that a directionally aimed duthentication attack would not reach. The pattern of what failed and what survived is the fingerprint of the method. Now here is what that means for the investigation. These devices are commercially available. Former Pima County Deputy Eric Maldonado confirmed in an interview with News Nation's Brian Enton that certain tools capable of this kind of targeted disruption can be purchased online for less than $30. They are small enough to fit in a jacket pocket. Some can be operated from a modified phone. They do not require technical expertise to operate in their basic form, though deploying one with the precision demonstrated on February 1st requires knowledge of the target networks, layout, and the physical geometry of the surrounding structures. But here is the part that matters most for finding who did this. Using a duthentication tool against a network you do not own is a federal crime. The Federal Communications Commission prohibits the operation, marketing, and sale of any device designed to interfere with authorized radio communications. Violations carry fines of up to $100,000 per incident and potential imprisonment. What that means in practical terms is that the FBI does not only have a kidnapping case, they have a separate federal communications violation, and federal violations open their own investigative threads. Purchase records. If the device was bought through any commercial channel, that transaction exists in a database tied to an identity, a shipping address, a payment method, search history. If the suspect used any internet-connected device to research authentication tools or wireless camera disruption in the weeks before February 1st, those searches exist at the ISP level even if the local browser history was cleared. The device's output signature. Every authentication tool generates a pattern of packet transmissions that can be characterized. If the FBI can identify what was used, they can identify where it came from. The federal charge is not a footnote. It is a separate entrance into the same investigation, and it may close faster than the kidnapping case itself. Now look at the porch footage again with this in mind. There is a visible object in the suspect's outer pocket. Former FBI Special Agent Tracy Walder, analyzing the footage publicly, described it as something with an antenna. Something that does not profile as a standard smartphone. She identified two possibilities, a walkie-talkie or a signal disruption device. Those two answers point in different directions, but both of them dismantle the same thing. If it was a walkie-talkie, the suspect was in active voice communication with at least one additional person during the operation. Someone at a perimeter, someone in a vehicle, someone receiving real-time confirmation of what was happening inside that house. That confirms a two-person minimum operation and introduces a second device that generated its own digital record, a second phone hitting a cell tower, a second account associated with that communication channel, a second trail. If it was a authentication tool, the suspect was running targeted electronic countermeasures against the neighborhood's surveillance infrastructure at the same moment they were conducting a federal kidnapping. That requires wireless networking knowledge, directional deployment skill, and the presence of mind to execute two concurrent operations under conditions of extreme stress. Neither of those profiles belongs to an impulsive, disorganized actor. Neither of those profiles belongs to someone who drove into the Catalina foothills on a random night because a light was on. Here is the contradiction that exposes what the suspect was doing with the backpack and the holster. A person carrying a authentication tool, one that requires advanced acquisition, research into wireless networking protocol vulnerabilities, and precise directional deployment against specific target devices, does not accidentally attach a holster on the wrong side out of inexperience. A person who tested ring camera behavior at a practice location 9 days in advance, selected a property with matching surveillance architecture, and executed a 41-minute operation in the dark without triggering a single noise complaint, does not make basic equipment errors because they are out of their depth. The holster was placed incorrectly on purpose. Consider what that staging accomplishes. Every investigator, every former law enforcement analyst, every person who views the porch footage and notices the wrong side holster immediately categorizes the suspect as someone unfamiliar with firearms carry, someone who assembled a kit from online research rather than from operational experience. The wrong holster generates a profile, and the profile it generates points away from someone with any professional or tactical background. It points toward an amateur, an opportunist, someone who watched too many crime documentaries and put together a costume from a shopping list. But the authentication tool does not belong in that profile. Neither does the January 23rd reconnaissance. Neither does 41 minutes of darkness and silence inside that house. Neither does the surgical precision of which cameras were disabled and which were left running. Those two versions of the same suspect cannot coexist unless one of them is deliberate theater. The cheap backpack reinforces the same misdirection. The Ozark Trail bag is the most anonymous possible container. It is the choice of someone who understood that the bag would become a focal point of public analysis and made certain that focal point told investigators nothing useful. A person with the planning capacity demonstrated throughout this operation does not carry a $20 bag because they could not afford better. They carry it because it generates the lowest possible signal about their identity. The appearance on that porch was designed. The holster, the bag, the unhurried approach, the single tap on the camera lens. Each element was calibrated to produce a profile in the mind of whoever reviewed the footage. And while every analyst was reconstructing that profile, the device in the pocket was already working on the neighbor's cameras. This is what behavioral misdirection looks like when it is executed by someone who understands how investigators think. You do not hide by being invisible. You hide by being visible in a way that makes people look at the wrong thing. The prop in the pocket is the piece of evidence that will not let go. One of those two versions of this suspect is a costume. The evidence tells us which one. And now we need to talk about the dog, because this detail was reported once and then largely set aside in favor of the more technically dramatic elements of this case. That is a mistake. What the dog did on the night of February 1st is not a soft human interest anecdote. It is corroborating observational evidence from a witness that cannot be coached, cannot be pressured, cannot misremember, and had no reason to be awake at that hour, except for one thing. The same neighbor whose cameras went dark that night told investigators that their dog woke them up. Not a brief alerting bark at a coyote moving through the wash. Not a short noise that faded back into the night. The dog woke up and insisted on going outside. This was significant enough to the neighbor that they mentioned it to investigators, because the dog does not do this. It sleeps through the night, every night, without exception. On February 1st, it could not. Once outside, the dog did not move toward the open desert, did not orient toward the road, did not scan the perimeter the way a dog responding to a scent or a sound from an unknown direction would. It stood and looked directly toward Nancy Guthrie's property, fixed still, focused on a specific direction at the exact moment the cameras facing that direction had gone offline. That is not coincidence. That requires explanation. Eric Maldonado, the former Pima County deputy with 29 years working residential crimes in the Catalina foothills, addressed this directly. He said that dogs remain among the most reliable sensory systems available in a residential surveillance context. Their auditory range extends significantly beyond human perception. They detect frequencies produced by electronic devices. They register ground vibration from footsteps on soil at distances that human hearing cannot reach. They track scent plumes carried on night air from positions across open desert terrain. What the dog may have detected is any of the following: the electronic signature of a deauthentication tool operating in the frequency range adjacent to the 2.4 GHz band, footsteps in the desert between the two properties made by someone positioning a device or moving toward Nancy's door, a scent carried from a direction the cameras could no longer confirm, or some combination of all three, arriving as a cluster of stimuli that the dog could not resolve into a recognizable and ignorable event. Whatever it detected was real enough to wake an animal that had never done this before, real enough to pull it outside and hold its attention in a single direction for long enough that the neighbor noticed, real enough that when investigators subsequently discovered that the cameras facing that same direction had gone dark at that same time, the dog's behavior became a corroborating data point rather than an unexplained animal reaction. Think about what that means for the coverage map the FBI is building. The map shows which cameras went offline and which stayed on. When the geometric footprint of the device is calculated, it will identify the position from which the deauthentication signal originated. If the dog was looking toward Nancy's property and the cameras in that same direction were offline, the footprint of the device likely centers on the space between the two properties, the desert between two houses where a person, or a prepositioned device, could reach the cameras facing Nancy's address while remaining outside the visual range of any camera that stayed operational. The dog was looking at the origin point. That is not a story detail. That is a location. Now connect everything that has been established and watch what the picture becomes. Someone spent weeks studying the Catalina foothills. They identified Nancy's property. They identified the surrounding surveillance architecture. They understood which cameras on neighboring properties had line of sight to her home. They selected a practice location 6.5 miles away with matching characteristics and used it to test ring camera behavior 9 days before the abduction. They acquired a device capable of targeting specific cameras directionally. They positioned themselves or their device in the gap between the properties in a location where no operational camera could record their presence. They disrupted the cameras facing Nancy's home before approaching her door. They spent 41 minutes inside the house. They navigated that space in near total darkness without incident. They left behind items that would generate no useful leads and removed the one item that carried their biological identity directly on it. They exited the neighborhood at 2:36 in the morning via a route that avoided the cameras they knew were still recording. And those cameras 2.5 miles away confirmed the departure timing matches the pacemaker's final transmission. Every one of those steps required knowledge. Knowledge of the neighborhood, knowledge of the cameras, knowledge of Nancy's routines, knowledge of the layout of her home, knowledge of the electronic architecture of the surrounding properties, and knowledge of how to obtain, configure, and deploy a deauthentication tool with directional precision. This is not the behavioral profile of a stranger. A stranger drives into a neighborhood and parks. Neighbors notice. A stranger walks down a residential street at 1 in the morning in the Catalina foothills. A dog hears them. A stranger does not know which side of a neighbor's house the cameras face, does not know the angles, does not know the gaps, but someone who has been in that neighborhood for years does. Eric Maldonado said it directly in his interview. He said he had worked burglaries in the Catalina foothills where the suspect lived on the same street as the victim. He said the intelligence it takes an outsider weeks to gather is information a neighbor accumulates without trying, passively, through daily exposure to the same streets and houses and routines. The camera positions, the angles, the lines of sight, the addresses that are occupied and which ones go dark at a certain hour. You drive past a house enough times, you know where the cameras point, without ever having decided to find out. This brings us to Tommaso Savannah Guthrie's husband, Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law, a man who has had a regular presence in and around the Catalina foothills for approximately 20 years, visiting Nancy's neighborhood through the normal rhythms of extended family life. Before examining the evidence, the standard must be stated clearly, and it must hold throughout. Presence in a neighborhood is not evidence of a crime. Familiarity with the location is not evidence of criminal involvement. Family relationship to a victim is not evidence of anything except family relationship. Nothing that follows constitutes an accusation. It constitutes a factual account of what the public record shows and what questions that record raises, applied with the same framework that would apply to any person whose profile intersects with the investigative questions this case presents. The standard does not change based on who the person is. It holds or it means nothing. With that established, following Nancy's disappearance, every publicly visible member of the Guthrie family participated in some form of public communication about the case. Savannah posted video statements to social media. She announced a $1 million reward. She made direct public appeals. Her daughter Cameron recorded a video message directed at the kidnapper. Her daughter Annie cooperated with investigators and was photographed in public near the home. Savannah appeared on camera and described every hour since Nancy's disappearance as agony. Investigative journalist Brian Enton reported that Tommaso Cioni had not been publicly visible for nearly a week before March 2nd. He told Megyn Kelly on her program that Tommaso, who has a distinctive physical appearance including a notable beard, had been essentially absent from public view during that period. On March 2nd, Tommaso appeared at the memorial gathering outside Nancy's home. He walked arm in arm with Savannah and Annie to the location. Within hours of that footage appearing, two comparisons began circulating simultaneously and have not stopped. The first was height. Savannah Guthrie is publicly documented at 5 feet 10 inches. The FBI's official description of the suspect places the individual at 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10. 4 weeks prior to March 2nd, public discussion had largely set aside Tommaso as a comparison subject on the basis of height, with estimates placing him at 6 feet or taller, which would put him outside the FBI's stated range. The memorial footage disrupted that assumption. In direct physical proximity to his wife, Tommaso does not appear to be significantly taller. The visual difference is inconsistent with a 2-inch height differential. His precise height has never been confirmed in any public record. The footage from March 2nd moved his apparent height into a range that is closer to the FBI's description than any previous visual comparison had suggested. The detail that was used to dismiss him no longer dismisses him. The second comparison was gait. People watching the memorial footage placed it side by side with the FBI's porch footage and began comparing movement, the rhythm of the stride, the pattern of weight transfer from one foot to the other, the relationship between the shoulders and the direction of travel, the angle of the head during walking. Forensic gait analysis is a recognized scientific discipline. It has been admitted as evidence in British courts. It is considered an emerging identification method in multiple jurisdictions. It requires controlled conditions, calibrated equipment, reference measurements, and credentialed expertise to produce conclusions that meet an evidentiary standard. What people were doing on their phones at home was none of those things, but the scale of that informal observation carries its own weight that investigators cannot dismiss. When a large number of independent observers, with no coordination between them and no shared incentive to reach a specific conclusion, independently arrive at the same unease when comparing two clips, that unease is data, not evidence in the legal sense, but a signal that a professional analysis is warranted and that the results of that analysis matter. The public record does not confirm whether investigators have conducted a professional forensic gait comparison using calibrated methodology. That is a question the investigation has not answered publicly. What the public record does confirm is this: the person who deployed a targeted electronic disruption against cameras facing Nancy Guthrie's property had specific knowledge of that neighborhood's surveillance geometry. The knowledge required to target specific cameras on specific sides of specific houses cannot be acquired from a single drive-through. It accumulates through repeated exposure to the same environment over time. Tommaso Cioni has been embedded in that family's physical geography for approximately 20 years. That is not an accusation. It is a factual statement that sits at the intersection of the investigative questions this case raises and the biographical record of a person whose profile the investigation cannot responsibly ignore. The question is not whether Tommaso Cioni is guilty. The question is whether investigators have applied the same rigorous analytical standard to him that this evidence demands. Whether the height analysis was done with calibrated tools rather than casual observation. Whether the gait comparison was done by a credentialed analyst rather than a social media overlay. Whether the cell tower data for his devices was pulled and examined for the relevant dates. Whether his whereabouts on January 23rd, the day of the backward walker test, were confirmed independently. Those are investigative questions. They have answers. Whether those answers have been obtained and what they show is something the public record does not currently reveal. Before we go to the pacemaker record, there is a thread of evidence that earlier reporting on this case introduced and then left unresolved. A thread that deserves a precise examination rather than a passing reference. 2 DNA contributors, reports from sources familiar with the investigation, stated that biological material recovered from the scene contained genetic profiles from more than one person. This was reported early and then largely subsumed by other developments. But if accurate, it changes the operational picture of February 1st in a fundamental way. A single-actor kidnapping is difficult enough to execute. One person entering an occupied residence, controlling a 64-year-old woman who is a physician and physically active, navigating an unfamiliar interior in near total darkness, and exiting with her without triggering a noise complaint or leaving visible evidence of struggle within a 41-minute window is a demanding operational task. If two people entered that house, the operational burden distributes and the investigative trail multiplies. Two people require coordination, a shared communication channel before, during, and after the operation, a degree of mutual trust sufficient to commit a federal crime together, a relationship between two individuals that exists somewhere in the documented record of both their lives and that investigators, given enough time and the right thread, can trace. Two-person operations also generate twice the biological material, twice the potential contact transfer surfaces, twice the phones that were or were not present in the cell tower coverage area on the night of February 1st. If a walkie-talkie was the object in the suspect's pocket, its counterpart device was carried by a second person somewhere in that neighborhood. That device generated its own signal, its own transmitter, its own potential record. The DNA processing timeline is a constraint that cannot be compressed beyond certain limits. The forensic laboratory analyzing biological material from this case, reported to be located in Florida, operates under the same processing pressures as every major crime laboratory in the country. Complex genetic profiles require weeks of careful laboratory work before a database comparison can be run. But here is what a database match would and would not tell investigators. A result from the combined DNA index system means the contributor has previously been arrested and processed through a jurisdiction that collects biological samples at intake. Their profile was already in the system. The result returns with a name attached. No match means one of three things. The contributor has no prior arrest record that generated a stored biological profile. The contributor comes from a jurisdiction whose database coverage is incomplete. Or, the contributor is a person whose background has never intersected with the American criminal justice system in a way that produced a sample. That third category includes most people who have led conventional law-abiding lives. The absence of a database match is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of a particular kind of background. One without prior criminal processing, one that requires the investigation's other threads to produce a name before the biological evidence can fulfill its function as a confirmation or elimination tool. The DNA evidence is waiting for the electronic investigation, the purchase records, the router logs, and the geographic analysis to generate a suspect. When a named suspect is identified through those threads and a comparison sample is obtained, the biological comparison is fast, days rather than months. The database search is the bottleneck. The confirmation is not, which means every advance in the signal disruption investigation, every data point added to the authentication footprint map, every gap identified in the cell tower record accelerates the point at which the DNA evidence becomes decisive. The two investigations are not parallel. They are sequential, and the electronic work comes first. Now let us go to the pacemaker record, because this thread of evidence has not been examined publicly with the depth it deserves, and what it contains is not just a hit stop. It is a biological account of what Nancy experienced in the 41 minutes before her pacemaker went silent. Nancy's device monitored her cardiac data continuously. It logged heart rate, it registered rhythm variation. It tracked physical activity through motion sensors. It timestamped every data point. It flagged anomalies automatically. When the transmission ended at 2:28, the receiving device logged not just the termination but the final readings before it. Investigators have access to a physiological record of Nancy's state throughout those 41 minutes. Whether her heart rate elevated, whether the rhythm changed in ways consistent with physical exertion or acute stress, whether the activity sensors detected rapid movement consistent with struggle, whether the data shows a gradual decline or an abrupt change that corresponds to a specific moment of intervention. None of that data has been released publicly, and it should not be. This is an active investigation. But its existence is not in dispute, and it means that the 41 minutes inside Nancy's home did not pass in evidentiary silence. There is a biological record of some portion of what happened, encoded in the transmission history of a device that had no reason to conceal it. Medical device forensics has already been established as legally admissible evidence in American courts. In Ohio, in 2017, pacemaker data was used successfully to challenge a defendant's account of events and contributed to a criminal conviction. The principle is established. The data is valid, and in this case, it is more detailed and more contemporaneous than most forensic evidence investigators typically have access to. The pacemaker knows what happened in that house. Now let us address the vehicle record and what it tells us about the route. The Ring camera 2.5 miles from Nancy's home captured a vehicle at 2:06. The sheriff confirmed the timing. But this camera did not just confirm departure. It confirmed direction. A vehicle traveling through the Catalina foothills at 2:36 in the morning is moving away from Nancy's property along a specific route. That route connects to specific streets. Those streets have a specific relationship to the camera positions that were operational that night. The fact that this camera, 2.5 miles away, captured the vehicle means the driver did not take a route that avoided it, which means either they did not know this camera was there, or they knew and assessed the risk as acceptable because the camera was too far from the disruption zone to have been disabled. If the driver knew the camera's location and made a deliberate routing decision based on that knowledge, that is another indicator of prior geographic familiarity. The kind of familiarity that comes from driving those streets regularly. From knowing which intersections have cameras and which do not. From having absorbed the surveillance architecture of the neighborhood the way you absorb any environment you move through day after day. The route a suspect takes when leaving a scene is not arbitrary. It reflects what they know about the terrain. And what the vehicle evidence shows is a driver who navigated a residential neighborhood at 2 in the morning. In the dark, at normal speeds, without hesitation, without wrong turns. Without the slow, uncertain movements of someone who has never driven those streets in the dark before. A stranger leaving an unfamiliar neighborhood at 2 in the morning under maximum stress does not move like that. Consider the exit conditions. The driver has just spent 41 minutes inside someone's home. They are transporting a person. They are acutely aware that any contact with a law enforcement vehicle in the next 30 minutes ends everything. They are navigating in residential darkness, and they do it cleanly. They pick a route, they hold a consistent speed, they reach the camera 2.5 miles away at exactly the moment the timing calculation says they should. That is not luck. That is someone who has driven that route before, many times under conditions where they were not under pressure, so that when the pressure arrived, the route was already encoded. The cell tower data surrounding this case has not produced a suspect identification through phone records. In most contemporary kidnapping investigations, tower analysis narrows the field within 72 hours. The absence of that result, 5 weeks into an investigation powered by the FBI's full digital forensic capability, points toward a narrow set of explanations. The suspect left their phone at a location distant from the scene. They disabled their phone's transmitting functions before entering the area. Or their phone was already present in that cell tower's coverage zone, and its presence on the night of February 1st did not register as anomalous because it was not anomalous. Because the phone is there regularly. A device that belongs in a place does not generate an alert by being in that place. There is also the router record. When a smartphone with wireless networking enabled comes within range of a router it is not connected to before, the phone broadcasts what are called probe requests. It broadcasts the names of networks it has previously connected to while scanning for familiar connections. These probe requests are logged by routers they approach without successfully connecting. If the suspect's phone had wireless networking enabled on the night of February 1st, and if it came within range of Nancy Guthrie's router, that router may contain a hardware identifier for the device and a list of network names the phone had previously joined. Each of those network names maps to a location, a home address, a workplace, a recurring destination, a pattern that identifies a person. The FBI has Nancy's router. Router log analysis takes hours, not months. If that data exists, it has been examined. What it shows is not public, but whether or not the probe record contains useful data. The router log will also show the time at which the device approached and the direction from which the signal was strongest. That is a position, not a name yet, but a position, combined with the authentication footprint, combined with the cell tower gaps, combined with the vehicle camera timing, begins to construct a location history for the suspect across the full timeline of February 1st. Each data source individually is incomplete. Together, they triangulate. Now, the question of motive, and this needs to be handled with more precision than public coverage has managed. Nancy Guthrie was not killed at her home. This matters enormously. The operational complexity of removing a living person from a secured property, transporting them, and maintaining control of them after departure is exponentially greater than the operational complexity of leaving a scene after causing death. Whoever planned this chose the harder path. That choice implies a specific reason. Operational kidnapping with a living subject as the objective falls into a limited number of investigative categories. Financial, where the hostage is held to extract a payment or concession. Personal, where the removal of the individual is itself the goal. For reasons that exist in the relationship history between the parties, evidentiary, where the individual is removed because their presence at the scene, their testimony, their biological material, or their memory of events constitutes a threat, or some combination of those elements. The medication left behind is relevant to this analysis. A person planning a financial kidnapping keeps the hostage alive as long as the negotiation is active. Leaving behind medication that maintains that hostage's health makes no sense. A person planning an evidentiary removal has a different calculation. If the objective is to prevent the individual from providing testimony or identification, The hostage's survival timeline is not the primary operational consideration. The wallet was left because taking it creates a traceable financial trail. The medication was left for a reason that still requires explanation, and the absence of any contact with Nancy's family or law enforcement in the weeks following the abduction suggests that if this was ever going to be framed as a financial crime, that framing has not materialized. Savannah Guthrie told the Today Show that the family has accepted the possibility that Nancy may no longer be alive. That statement is not defeat. It is the honest acknowledgement that the people who love her most have had to hold every possible outcome simultaneously for weeks without the certainty of knowing which one is real. What the family has not accepted, what they will not accept, is not knowing where Nancy is. Not knowing where a person physically is, alive or not, is a specific and compounding form of grief, and it is also an investigative gap. Physical remains carry evidence. They carry biological material from the person who transported them. They carry trace evidence from the environment where they were held. They carry information about the route taken and the time elapsed. Finding Nancy, regardless of her condition, closes investigative gaps that remain open as long as her location is unknown. The search continues because the evidence demands it, and because the people who loved her have not stopped. Now to where the case stands today. On March 6th, the Pima County Sheriff's Department assigned 4 detectives and a sergeant to a dedicated task force. They are working this case full-time. They are working out of an FBI field office in Tucson, physically co-located with federal agents, looking at the same evidence at the same time. That is not the structure of an investigation that has stalled. A cold case unit does not move into a federal building. You make that structural commitment when the investigation has produced enough specificity that you need local expertise and federal resources running in parallel without the delay of interagency communication gaps. You make that commitment when you are building something specific and you need everyone in the same room. The door-to-door canvas on March 6th was part of that build. The agents were not reviewing old tips. They were collecting the data needed to complete the authentication footprint map. Every homeowner who reported a disruption, every camera that logged an outage, every timestamp on a system that went offline, adds a data point to the geometric model of what was deployed and from where. When that map is complete, it will show the position from which the device was operated. A physical location in the Catalina foothills, a point in the desert between 2 houses, or a position on the road, or a location on Nancy's property that predates the suspect's approach on camera. That position will be examined for physical trace evidence, for footprints in the desert soil, for tire impressions from a vehicle that parked nearby, for biological material from someone standing in a specific spot while no camera was recording. In that position, added to the router probe record, the cell tower gap, the vehicle camera timing, the pacemaker data, the purchase record for the device, and the coverage map showing which cameras were affected and which were not, will construct a complete picture. The suspect did not disappear. They left a record shaped like themselves. Every decision they made about what to bring, what to disable, which route to take, what to leave behind, what to take, is a data point that reflects who they are and what they know. And the shape of that knowledge, the specific familiarity with a specific neighborhood's surveillance infrastructure, is something that does not come from planning alone. It comes from being there. The technology that was supposed to protect Nancy Guthrie failed her on the night of February 1st. The cameras went dark. The neighbor's dog stood in the yard looking toward her property at an hour when it had never been awake before. The recording that should have existed came back as unavailable, but the technology that defeated those cameras left its own absence. And the absence, mapped against what stayed online and what went dark at what moment, tells investigators precisely where to look. A footprint, a position, a location where a person stood with a device in their pocket while no camera that could see them was recording. The person who pressed that button is fine, not because they were careless, because the specific way they were careful is itself a category of evidence. Authentication attacks leave packet signatures. Purchases leave transaction records. Searches leave ISP logs. The absence of a phone in a location where that phone should have been pinging is as loud as the phone itself would have been. And the dog that was awake at the wrong hour, looking in the wrong direction, is a witness that cannot be. Every layer of planning is a layer the FBI is currently removing. And what is underneath is a very small number of people who knew this neighborhood the way you know it. You have been coming to for 20 years. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family. A case in which a woman who did everything right was taken anyway. The search for where Nancy Guthrie is continues. The search for who did this continues. And the evidence, the electronic footprints, the biological record, the coverage map, the gap in the cell tower data, the dog that heard what the cameras could no longer record, is converging. Someone in Tucson knows the answer, and the map the FBI is building will reach them. There is one more thing that needs to be said before this analysis closes, about what this case represents beyond the specific evidence and the specific people involved. Nancy Guthrie did everything right. She lived in a community with a reputation for security. She installed cameras. She wore a medical device that transmitted her biological data continuously to multiple connected systems. She had family who checked in with her. She was careful in the specific ways that careful people are careful, and none of it was sufficient against someone who had spent the time necessary to understand exactly how each layer of that protection worked and exactly how to defeat it. That is the most disturbing technical finding in this entire case. Not the authentication tool specifically. Not the pacemaker data. Not the cell tower gap. The disturbing finding is that comprehensive consumer-grade security, cameras, wireless monitoring, medical telemetry, is vulnerable to a person with sufficient motivation, sufficient time, and $30 of equipment from an online retailer. The authentication attack that disabled specific cameras while leaving others online is not a technique that requires advanced hacking knowledge. It is documented in publicly available cybersecurity literature. It is the subject of instructional videos. It is a tool used legally and legitimately by network administrators to test their own systems. It has simply never been applied in this way before in a kidnapping case that received this level of public attention. And now that it has been applied here, and now that the FBI has publicly confirmed they are investigating a wireless disruption as part of this case, the technique is visible. Other investigators in other jurisdictions are now asking whether similar disruptions occurred in cases they are working. Other homeowners are now examining their camera logs for nights when footage is unavailable without explanation. The investigation of this case is already changing how people think about residential security and its limits. That matters, not as a silver lining to a tragedy, but as an acknowledgement that the evidentiary record of what happened on February 1st in the Catalina foothills has implications beyond this case. Beyond Tucson, beyond Nancy Guthrie's family. The investigation will close. It always does. Eventually, cases like this do not stay unsolved forever when the FBI commits the level of resources currently committed here. The evidence is too specific. The techniques used were too distinctive. The planning required too much prior contact with the environment where the crime occurred. The footprint is there. The purchase record is there. The router log is there. The cell tower gap is there. The DNA is there, waiting for a name to match against. What remains is time, and the patience of investigators who have not stopped working. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, and a case that may still have answers waiting to be found. The search for truth continues.